The morning sun cast long shadows across the palace corridors as Queen Camilla walked briskly toward the breakfast room. Her heels clicked against the marble floors, echoing through the empty halls. She had always enjoyed these quiet moments before the palace came alive with staff and visitors. But today felt different. There was tension in the air that she couldn't quite place. The servants seemed to avoid her eyes, and even her personal assistant had been unusually quiet during their morning briefing. King Charles sat at the long dining table, his face buried behind the Times newspaper. Steam rose from his untouched cup of tea, and his breakfast plate remained full. This had become a common sight over the past few weeks. The king seemed distant, preoccupied with matters he refused to discuss. "Good morning, darling," Camilla said, taking her seat across from him. She reached for the silver coffee pot, her movements graceful despite the growing unease in her chest. Charles lowered his newspaper slightly, his eyes meeting hers for just a moment before returning to the headlines. "Morning," he replied curtly, his voice lacking its usual warmth. The silence stretched between them like a chasm. Outside the tall windows, gardeners tended to the rose bushes, their work continuing as if nothing had changed. But inside the breakfast room, everything felt fragile, as if one wrong word could shatter the careful balance they had maintained. Camilla tried to fill the silence with small talk about upcoming engagements and charity events, but Charles's responses were minimal. She noticed how his hands trembled slightly as he turned the pages of his newspaper, and how his jaw was set in a way that suggested he was holding back words that threatened to spill out. Unknown to either of them, in a small office 3 floors below, a royal secretary was preparing documents that would change everything. The morning routine they were going through would soon become a memory. A final moment of normalcy before their world shifted completely. The king finally folded his newspaper and stood up, his chair scraping against the floor with more force than necessary. "I have meetings all morning," he announced, not looking at his wife. "We'll need to discuss some important matters later." Camilla watched him leave, her coffee growing cold in her hands. She had no idea that those important matters would involve papers that were already being reviewed by lawyers. Papers that would formally end their marriage and change the course of the monarchy forever. As she sat alone in the breakfast room, surrounded by portraits of previous monarchs, Camilla felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. Something was coming, something that would test everything she thought she knew about her life as queen. The palace walls seemed to close in around her as she tried to understand what was happening to her marriage and her future. 3 weeks earlier, King Charles had discovered something that shook him to his core. It wasn't a single dramatic revelation, but rather a series of small discoveries that painted a picture he could no longer ignore. It started with phone calls that ended abruptly when he entered the room. Then came the mysterious meetings that weren't on Camilla's official schedule. The king's private secretary, a man who had served the royal family for over 20 years, had approached him with concerns about financial irregularities in the queen's personal accounts. Charles had initially dismissed these worries as administrative errors. After all, Camilla had always been involved in numerous charitable organizations, and money flowed in and out of various accounts regularly. But when the secretary presented him with bank statements showing large transfers to offshore accounts, Charles felt his world begin to crumble. The investigation that followed was conducted in absolute secrecy. Only 3 people knew about it: the king, his most trusted advisor, and a discreet private investigator who specialized in financial crimes. What they uncovered over the following days painted a disturbing picture of deception and betrayal. Camilla had been siphoning money from royal charities for months, redirecting funds meant for children's hospitals and veterans organizations into her personal accounts. The amounts were staggering, millions of pounds that should have gone to people in desperate need. But the financial betrayal was only part of the story. The private investigator had also uncovered evidence of secret meetings with tabloid journalists, where Camilla had been selling intimate details about the royal family's private life. Photos, personal conversations, and even medical information had been traded for substantial payments. Charles remembered the night he confronted the evidence alone in his study. The leather-bound folders contained bank statements, recorded phone conversations, and photographs that left no room for doubt. His hands shook as he read transcript after transcript of his wife discussing their most private moments with reporters. The betrayal cut deeper than anything he had experienced in his long life. This wasn't just about money or media attention. It was about trust, loyalty, and the sacred duty they both had sworn to uphold when they married. For days, Charles wrestled with what to do. Part of him wanted to confront Camilla immediately, to give her a chance to explain or make amends. But his advisors warned him that any premature action could lead to a massive scandal that would damage the monarchy beyond repair. The sleepless nights that followed were filled with agonizing decisions. Charles paced his private chambers, weighing his options while the weight of the crown seemed heavier than ever before. He thought about their years together, the good times they had shared, and the public face they had presented to the world. But every time he considered forgiveness, he returned to the evidence. Children who needed medical treatment had been denied because funds were diverted. Veterans struggling with mental health had lost support because money intended for their care had vanished into Camilla's accounts. The king realized that his personal feelings had to take second place to his duty to the people. The monarchy's reputation was at stake, and more importantly, real people had suffered because of his wife's actions. The decision, when it finally came, felt both inevitable and devastating. Captain James Morrison had served as a royal guard for 15 years, but he had never been asked to do anything like this. Standing in the king's private study, he felt the weight of the golden envelope in his hands, like it contained explosives rather than legal documents. "You understand the sensitivity of this task, Captain?" King Charles said, his voice heavy with exhaustion. The king looked older than his years. The stress of recent weeks etched deeply into his face. "This must be handled with absolute discretion." Morrison nodded, though his heart was racing. Inside the envelope were divorce papers that would end the king's marriage to Queen Camilla. More than that, they contained evidence of financial crimes that could send the queen to prison. The future of the monarchy hung in the balance. "Sir, are you certain about this approach?" Morrison asked carefully. "Perhaps there's another way to handle the situation?" Charles walked to the window, gazing out at the grounds where tourists gathered at the palace gates, unaware of the drama unfolding inside. "I've spent weeks considering every option, Captain. The evidence is overwhelming, and the damage she's caused goes far beyond our personal relationship." The king handed Morrison a second folder, this one containing photographs and documents that outlined the full scope of Camilla's betrayal. As Morrison reviewed the materials, his respect for the queen crumbled. The charitable organizations that had been robbed, the private family moments sold to tabloids, the systematic deception that had gone on for months. "The queen will be in the rose garden at 3 o'clock for her daily walk," Charles continued. "She'll be alone except for her usual security detail. I need you to approach her there and deliver these papers personally." Morrison understood why the king had chosen him for this task. Unlike other staff members, he had no personal relationship with the queen. He was professional, reliable, and strong enough to handle whatever reaction the papers might provoke. "What should I expect, sir?" Morrison asked, thinking about the various ways the queen might respond to such devastating news. "I honestly don't know," Charles admitted. "Camilla is an actress by nature. She might deny everything, she might break down, or she might attack. Be prepared for anything. But remember that everything you see and hear must remain confidential." The king walked back to his desk and picked up a pen, signing one final document. "This also contains an ultimatum, Captain. The queen has 24 hours to respond. If she doesn't agree to a quiet divorce and restitution for the stolen funds, the evidence will be turned over to the police." Morrison felt the enormous responsibility settling on his shoulders. He wasn't just delivering divorce papers, he was potentially saving the monarchy from a scandal that could destroy it forever. The British people trusted the royal family, and that trust had been betrayed in the worst possible way. "One more thing, Captain," Charles added as Morrison prepared to leave. "I want you to watch her face when she reads the evidence. After all these years of marriage, I need to know if there's any genuine remorse, any sign that the woman I married is still in there somewhere." Morrison tucked the envelope securely inside his uniform jacket, feeling like he was carrying a bomb with a lit fuse. In less than an hour, he would walk up to the Queen of England and hand her papers that would end her marriage, destroy her reputation, and possibly send her to prison. As he left the king's study, Morrison caught sight of himself in an ornate mirror in the hallway. He looked like any other royal guard going about his duties, but he knew that in a few hours he would be remembered as the man who delivered the most shocking divorce papers in royal history. The Rose Garden was Queen Camilla's favorite place in the entire palace grounds. She visited it every afternoon at exactly 3 o'clock, a routine that had become as predictable as the changing of the guard. Today, she walked among the blooming flowers, unaware that this would be her last peaceful moment as queen. Captain Morrison watched from a distance as Camilla bent to smell a particularly beautiful red rose. She was dressed in a cream-colored suit with pearl earrings, looking every inch the royal she had become. Her security detail maintained their usual discreet distance, allowing her the illusion of privacy while keeping her safe. Morrison's heart pounded as he approached. The envelope felt heavier with each step, and he rehearsed the words he would use. "Your Majesty, I have an urgent message from the king." Simple, direct, professional. Camilla looked up as she heard footsteps on the gravel path. She smiled warmly at Morrison, recognizing him as one of the more senior guards. "Good afternoon, Captain. Lovely weather we're having, isn't it?" "Your Majesty," Morrison began, his voice steady despite his racing pulse. "I have an urgent and private message from His Majesty the King." He held out the golden envelope, noting how the Queen's expression shifted from casual friendliness to concern. "From Charles?" she asked, taking the envelope with manicured fingers. "How unusual. He could have simply called me or waited until dinner." Morrison stepped back respectfully but remained close enough to observe her reaction, as the king had requested. Camilla opened the envelope with the same casual confidence she had shown thousands of times before, when handling royal correspondence. But as she read the first page, her face changed completely. The color drained from her cheeks and her hands began to tremble. She looked up at Morrison with confusion, as if hoping he might tell her this was some kind of mistake. "I don't understand," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "These papers, they're talking about divorce. There must be some error." Morrison remained silent, watching as she continued reading. When she reached the pages containing the financial evidence, Camilla's legs seemed to give way slightly, and she reached out to steady herself against a garden bench. The transformation was shocking. The confident, regal woman who had entered the garden was disappearing before Morrison's eyes, replaced by someone who looked frightened and desperate. She flipped through the pages frantically, her breathing becoming rapid and shallow. "The bank statements, the recordings," she muttered, talking more to herself than to Morrison. Where did he get these?" When she reached the photograph showing her meeting with tabloid journalists, Camilla let out a small cry and actually staggered backward. Morrison moved slightly closer, concerned that she might faint, but she waved him away with a sharp gesture. "This is impossible," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. She was looking at evidence that couldn't be denied. Proof of actions she had thought were completely secret. Morrison watched as different emotions crossed her face in rapid succession. Shock, fear, anger, and then something that might have been calculation. He could almost see her mind working, trying to find a way out of the situation. "Did Charles really send you with these?" she asked, looking directly at Morrison for the first time since opening the envelope. "Yes, Your Majesty. His Majesty asked me to deliver them personally, and to inform you that you have 24 hours to respond." The mention of a deadline seemed to snap Camilla back to reality. She straightened her shoulders and lifted her chin, some of her royal composure returning, but Morrison could see the fear still lurking in her eyes. 24 hours, she repeated slowly. "And if I don't respond as he wishes?" Morrison had memorized the king's exact words. "The evidence will be turned over to the appropriate authorities." "Your Majesty." For a moment, Camilla stood perfectly still, surrounded by the beautiful roses that had given her so much peace over the years. Then she folded the papers carefully and slipped them back into the envelope. After Captain Morrison left, Camilla remained in the rose garden for another hour, sitting on the stone bench with the envelope clutched in her hands. Her mind raced through possibilities, excuses, and potential escape routes, but every path seemed to lead to the same devastating conclusion. She thought about calling her lawyer, but the evidence was too clear. She considered confronting Charles directly, but she knew he wouldn't have taken this step unless he was absolutely certain of his facts. Most terrifying of all, she realized that someone had been watching her for weeks, documenting her every move and recording her private conversations. When she finally returned to the palace, Camilla went straight to her private apartments. She dismissed her staff, claiming she had a headache, and locked herself in her bedroom. There, She spread all the papers across her bed and examined them with the desperate attention of someone looking for a lifeline. The bank statements were damning. Every transfer, every withdrawal, every payment was documented with painful precision. The charity money she had taken seemed enormous when laid out in black and white. Children's hospitals had lost funding, veterans' programs had been canceled, and elderly care facilities had been forced to close, all because she had diverted their money for her own use. But it was the photographs that truly broke her spirit. Pictures of her meeting with journalists in coffee shops and hotel lobbies, exchanging information for cash payments. She remembered each meeting, each betrayal of her family's trust. At the time, it had felt like harmless gossip, but seeing it documented this way made her realize the magnitude of her actions. The recordings were perhaps the worst part. Hearing her own voice discussing Charles's health concerns, William and Catherine's private arguments, and even details about the grandchildren's schooling made her feel sick. She had sold out the people who had welcomed her into their family, all for money she didn't even need. As evening approached, Camilla found herself thinking about her stepdaughter-in-law, Catherine, who had always been kind to her despite the complicated family dynamics. She thought about the grandchildren who called her Gan and trusted her completely. They would all learn about her betrayal soon enough, and their disappointment would be unbearable. The Queen tried to eat dinner, but food felt like ash in her mouth. Every time she looked at the elegant surroundings of her royal apartments, the priceless artwork, the antique furniture, the luxurious fabrics, she was reminded of what she was about to lose. Around midnight, Camilla called her sister, the only person she felt she could trust with the truth. The conversation was painful and tearful, but it helped her begin to understand the full scope of what she had done. Her sister was shocked and disappointed, but she also provided something Camilla desperately needed: honest advice. "You have to take responsibility for this," her sister told her over the phone. "You can't deny it, you can't fight it, and you can't try to blame anyone else. The only chance you have of salvaging any dignity is to admit what you've done and try to make it right." The words stung, but Camilla knew they were true. She had been living in a fantasy world where her actions had no consequences, where she could take money meant for sick children and sell family secrets without anyone getting hurt. The evidence in front of her proved how wrong she had been. By dawn, Camilla had made her decision. She couldn't undo the damage she had caused, but she could try to minimize the harm to the monarchy and the family she had betrayed. The scared, desperate woman who had received the papers in the rose garden was gone, replaced by someone who finally understood the weight of her choices. She spent the morning writing letters to Charles, to William and Catherine, to the charitable organizations she had robbed, and to the British people who had trusted her. Each letter was an admission of guilt and an apology, but she knew that words alone couldn't repair the damage she had done. The next morning arrived gray and drizzling, matching the somber mood that had settled over the palace. King Charles sat in his study, staring at his phone and waiting for word from Camilla. The 24-hour deadline was approaching, and he had heard nothing from his wife since the papers were delivered. At exactly noon, there was a soft knock on the study door. Captain Morrison entered carrying another envelope, this one cream-colored and bearing Camilla's personal seal. "From Her Majesty, sir," Morrison said quietly, placing the envelope on the king's desk. The captain had barely slept, knowing that his actions the previous day had set these momentous events in motion. Charles opened the envelope with steady hands, though his heart was racing. Inside were 3 items: a signed copy of the divorce papers, a formal letter of confession, and Camilla's wedding rings wrapped in a silk handkerchief. The letter was handwritten in Camilla's distinctive script, and as Charles read it, he felt a mixture of relief, sadness, and something that might have been respect for the woman who had finally faced the truth. "My dearest Charles," the letter began, "I cannot deny the evidence you have presented, nor can I offer any excuse that would justify my actions. I have betrayed not only you and our marriage, but the trust of the British people and the sacred duty we swore to uphold together." Charles continued reading as Camilla detailed her crimes in her own words. She admitted to stealing from charities, selling family secrets to the media, and living a double life that had brought shame to the monarchy. More importantly, she took full responsibility for her actions without trying to shift blame or make excuses. "I understand that you have no choice but to divorce me," The letter continued. I also understand that criminal charges may follow, and I am prepared to face whatever consequences the law demands. I have already contacted my solicitor to arrange the return of all stolen funds, though I know that money cannot undo the harm I have caused to those who needed help. The king felt tears welling up in his eyes as he read the final paragraph. I know that I have destroyed any chance of forgiveness, but I want you to know that my love for you was real, even if my actions proved that I was not worthy of your love in return. I will sign whatever documents are necessary and leave quietly, causing no further scandal to the crown. Charles set the letter down and picked up Camilla's rings. The engagement ring was a family heirloom, passed down through generations of royal brides. The wedding band was simple platinum, engraved with their wedding date and the words, "My darling wife," in Charles's own handwriting. Captain Morrison had remained standing at attention throughout this emotional moment. Sir, if I may ask what happens now? Charles stood and walked to his window, looking out at the gardens where tourists were gathering for the afternoon tour. Now we begin the difficult process of protecting the monarchy while ensuring that justice is served. The Queen has made the right choice by confessing, but that doesn't erase what she's done. The king turned back to Morrison. I'll need you to coordinate with the palace legal team. The confession makes things cleaner, but we still need to manage the public announcement and coordinate with law enforcement. Morrison nodded, understanding the enormous challenges ahead. The royal family had weathered many scandals over the years, but nothing quite like this. A queen confessing to theft and betrayal was unprecedented in modern times. There's one more thing, Captain, Charles said, his voice heavy with emotion. I want you to personally oversee the Queen's departure from the palace. She's earned the right to leave with some dignity, even after everything she's done. As Morrison prepared to leave, Charles called out one final instruction. And Captain, thank you for handling yesterday's task with such professionalism. I know it wasn't easy. Morrison paused at the door. Sir, if I may say so, you've handled this situation with remarkable grace. The monarchy will survive this because of your leadership. Alone again in his study, Charles sat down heavily in his chair. The confession letter lay before him, marking the end of his marriage and the beginning of a new chapter for the royal family. Outside, life continued normally, but inside the palace walls, everything had changed forever. 6 months later, the palace had settled into a new rhythm. The divorce had been finalized quietly, with minimal media attention thanks to careful legal maneuvering and Camilla's cooperation. She had kept her promise to leave without causing additional scandal, relocating to a modest cottage in the countryside where she lived under an assumed name. Captain Morrison had been promoted to head of the king's personal security detail, a recognition of his discretion and professionalism during the crisis. He often thought about that day in the rose garden and marveled at how much had changed since then. The stolen money had been returned to the affected charities, along with substantial additional donations from the royal family's personal funds. The children's hospitals reopened their wings, the veterans' programs resumed their services, and the elderly care facilities were able to expand their offerings. While the harm could never be completely undone, the people who had suffered were finally getting the help they needed. King Charles had thrown himself into his royal duties with renewed energy, as if the resolution of his personal crisis had freed him to focus completely on serving his country. He seemed older but wiser, and those closest to him noted a new depth to his character that hadn't been there before. The public had eventually learned about the divorce, but the palace's careful management of the story had focused on irreconcilable differences rather than the criminal behavior that had actually ended the marriage. The full truth was known only to a small circle of trusted advisors, law enforcement officials, and royal family members. Prince William and Catherine had been devastated when they learned the details of Camilla's betrayal, but they had rallied around the king with unwavering support. The younger generation of royals had stepped up their public duties, helping to maintain the monarchy's strong reputation during the difficult transition period. Morrison often encountered tourists asking about the Queen's absence, and he had become skilled at deflecting their questions with polite but uninformative responses. The official story was that the former Queen was pursuing private interests, which was technically true since her primary interest now was staying out of prison. The legal consequences for Camilla had been less severe than they might have been. Her full cooperation, complete restitution, and agreement to never speak publicly about royal family matters had earned her a suspended sentence and community service. She now worked at a local charity shop, serving the same types of people she had once stolen from. Captain Morrison sometimes wondered if she had learned anything from her experience, or if she simply regretted getting caught. The woman he had seen in the rose garden that day had seemed genuinely shocked by her own actions, but he knew that people were capable of remarkable self-deception. The king had never spoken of his former wife after signing the final divorce papers. When asked about his personal life, he focused on his children, grandchildren, and royal duties. He had built a wall around the painful memories, protecting himself from the betrayal that had nearly destroyed him. One evening, as Morrison made his final security rounds, he found the king sitting alone in the rose garden, where it all began. The flowers were in full bloom again, and the peaceful setting seemed to have regained its tranquil atmosphere. "Beautiful evening, isn't it, Captain?" Charles said without turning around. "Yes, sir. Very peaceful." The king was quiet for a moment, then spoke again. "I learned something important through all of this, Morrison. The crown isn't just about privilege and ceremony. It's about trust, the trust of the people we serve. When that trust is broken, everything else becomes meaningless." Morrison understood. The monarchy had survived this crisis because the king had chosen duty over personal loyalty, justice over convenience. It hadn't been easy, but it had been right. As they walked back toward the palace together, Morrison reflected on how one envelope delivered on a quiet afternoon had changed everything. The truth had been painful, but it had also been liberating. The king was free to rebuild, the monarchy was stronger, and the people who had been harmed were finally receiving justice. Sometimes the most difficult decisions led to the best outcomes, even when the cost seemed unbearable at the time.